Okay, so an additional major piece of this project was to assemble a blue carbon database. So this was in our proposal. This was something we wanted to do particularly with end users in mind so that we could accumulate, compile the data and make that data, those data available to anyone who's interested in blue carbon in the region for whatever reason. So in this database, we wanted to assemble all the information we could find on stocks values, sequestration rate data, and potentially other metrics of blue carbon in coastal ecosystems. We wanted a database that would be expandable to other types of data. So as this process progressed, we decided not to include greenhouse gas emissions data initially, but we wanted to create a database that would be expandable and where we could in the future add greenhouse gas emissions data and above ground or below ground biomass values for these different ecosystem types. And we wanted a database that would meet a range of different types of end users, everyone from academic researchers to policymakers to wetland managers, restoration practitioners, and so forth. And these are some examples of ways in which we wanted the database to conceptually be used by this diverse group of end users. So for instance, we wanted end users to have the ability to calculate blue carbon stocks on a habitat basis or on a regional basis. Say you wanted stocks values for the southern Oregon coast, for instance. We wanted to be able, researchers or other users to be able to calculate carbon sequestration rates by wetland type. So that would benefit restoration practitioners and others. We wanted data to be available to researchers. I'll mention this as the talk progresses, but we're working with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, who are building a national and even international database on blue carbon. And we wanted also to have, through this exercise, really be able to identify data gaps. And we've talked a lot about that this morning in this workshop, but what are the data gaps and what would be the future research priorities in filling these gaps? So the initial focal area geographically for the database was Cape Mendocino, California, so just south of Humboldt Bay and the Eel River Delta to northern Washington. We wanted to collect data from all three of the major subregions within the Pacific Northwest, so the outer coast of Northern California to Washington, the Salish Sea, and then the Columbia River estuary, which is kind of its own beast. As the database progressed, partly driven by data availability and partly the interest in making ourselves as regionally relevant as possible, we've also been including data from British Columbia and the San Francisco Bay Area. And then I'll talk a little bit later. We have the potential to expand all the way from Baja California to Alaska because there are a number of data sets that we've discovered. So our database includes all 5 of the wetland types that we've already talked about in this workshop: seagrass, low marsh, high marsh, forested tidal swamps, and pastures. And we also want to include any data, if available, from the other wetland types that we weren't able to sample in our stocks project, mainly for budget limitations, not because they're not important, but we had to prioritize. So those include scrub wetlands, restored areas, disturbed tidal wetlands, so they might be partially tidal, for muted tidal, for instance, and then unvegetated tide flats. And these are the types of blue carbon data we could have included in the database. They vary in terms of whether they're common or whether we felt they were quite rare within the region. And we really decided to, for this particular project, to just focus on these 2 data types. So carbon density in stocks, which are relatively the most data-rich type we have for the region. And then sediment accretion rates and carbon sequestration rates. So if you have a stocks or a density value and you have an accretion rate value, you can get a sequestration rate. And those are moderately common in a couple of different methods that are used to estimate those rates. So in order to collate the data, this really wasn't a formal meta-analysis. We didn't go into Web of Science and do a specific list of search terms. We did use the literature a little bit, but a lot of the data that was discovered really came from you guys in the room and from your colleagues. So these were people already in the Pacific Northwest Working Group that we knew were doing a project in a certain area. We knew about their data, and so we reached out to them and asked to be able to incorporate that into the database. We did do some Web of Science searches. I was particularly interested in trying to find something from Alaska because that does seem to be a big data gap. And then the Smithsonian, they've got a full-time, 2 to 3 people full-time working on their particular database. They have compiled some data already, more so for California than for the Pacific Northwest. So didn't need to reinvent the wheel. We just pulled the data from the data that they had already compiled. And then actually social media turned out to be kind of interesting. I put out a couple of tweets from time to time and actually got some responses to the tweets and probably discovered a data set or two just by social media that I didn't know about. So these are all the data sets that are currently in the working version of the database as of this month. The top one, Kaufman et al., this is our stocks project, so 204 stocks cores, and we also collected, I don't think this came up yet, but we collected a couple of extra cores to measure sequestration rates. So 2 of those have been analyzed by Scott Bridgham's lab, and I think 7 are John Rybzik's lab is analyzing another 7. So we had a little bit of extra funding to get a few sequestration rates, particularly from tidal swamps. The next largest data set is from Erin Peck, who's a graduate student at OSU. With Rob Wheatcroft. Laura Brophy's been involved in some of that sampling as well. She has 72 stocks cores and quite a few sequestration cores from Oregon tidal marshes. Number of California data sets interspersed in here, and then get smaller as you go. The total number of cores here is about 590 so far that we've been able to compile. These are data sets here that we know about but haven't been incorporated into the database yet. So, with some exceptions. So, let's see here. There are 2 exceptions on here that the data just came in. So I think Carolyn Prentice is right in the process of sharing data with us. And then Melissa Hall, who's a graduate student at UC Davis, I think she's on the call still. She just provided a data set on California marshes and seagrasses this weekend, so we'll be incorporating those. So some of these people may decide for publication reasons not to share the data, but most of the people on this list have said that they'd like to work on it and help provide the data for the database. So we currently have 596 cores that are in the physical database itself. I put this talk together a few weeks ago, so I've only summarized 568. If everybody here shares their data, we'll probably have about 900 cores for a region from Baja California to Ketchimak Bay in Alaska. So if all those data sets come in. So currently the cores are from northern British Columbia, the San Francisco Bay Area, relatively evenly distributed between California, Oregon, Washington, a little bit less from BC, and none yet from Alaska, but hopefully. This map, it's really hard to see here with this lighting. But these are all the core locations for British Columbia and Washington. It's under the stop share. That's the Skeena Estuary. That's our northernmost site. We have a couple here on Vancouver Island. And then this is a blow up of the core locations in the Salish Sea. And then these are the core locations from the Columbia River Estuary down to San Francisco Bay. So pretty decent geographic coverage. You are missing areas that have small estuaries and parts of the outer coast. So this is a summary of the cores in the database by wetland type. So this includes both stocks cores and sequestration cores. Some cores people did both. The most prevalent wetland type we have are tidal marshes, so probably about 75-80% of all the cores are from tidal marshes. We have some from tide flats, seagrass is the next best sampled, scrub shrub, tidal swamp, and then some pasture cores. one of the wetland types that is not very well represented are those scrub, shrub, and tidal swamp cores. But we know from some work that's been done by Laura Brophy and others that actually tidal swamps were probably a very common wetland type in the Pacific Northwest. So this is an example from the Siuslaw in Central Oregon. And all of these green areas in this map that Laura produced, these are areas that were probably formerly tidal swamp areas. The remaining ones are these little red patches. So most of this estuary probably was actually tidal swamp. And this pattern may hold for the Salish Sea, for example, and many of the other estuaries on the outer coast of Oregon. So we have relatively little data from a habitat type that probably historically was really, really important in the region. This is a summary of cores by the disturbance regime. So most of our cores are from least disturbed natural systems. We have a few from disturbed marshes. These are impounded, so these would be our pastures. We have some restored, I think mainly marsh cores. And then we have a few that we haven't been able to classify yet, but hopefully can reach out to the authors and get figure out which classes those go into. This is a summary of the cores in the database by their length. So the median core length we have is 76 centimeters, so not quite a meter in depth. That's the median here. Lots of cores that are shallow, 50 centimeters or less. And then we have a fair number of cores that are up to 3 meters. Those are mostly the cores that our stocks project took. But there are a few cores from San Francisco Bay, for instance, I think went to 7 meters. So on rare occasion, you get these really deep cores, and you can look at essentially a 10,000-year timeline of carbon accumulation at your site. So this is the kind of crude schematic of the database structure. At this point, it's really a series of flat files and spreadsheets that are linked by core ID. So we have a core ID that's common, and then we have flat files on one on core location and associated environmental data. And then the larger flat file contains all of the down core bulk density, carbon content, accretion rate, and carbon accumulation rate data. And then these dashed arrows indicate that we can expand using the common core ID. We can include other data types in the future in the database. Okay, so this is just a lot of studies, if they've been published, and a lot of the data actually have not been published yet or sort of about to be published. But we wanted, because methodologies can kind of differ from study to study, we want to also, with the raw data that the authors provided, compute our own stocks in a consistent manner. So the two key pieces of information that we needed from everyone contributing data on stocks was the down core bulk density and then the down core percent organic carbon. Now a lot of studies, I'd say maybe 40% or so, only measured percent organic matter by loss on ignition, which is a cheaper way to do that. But we had to convert that percent organic matter to a percent organic carbon. And there's a number of relationships that are available in the literature. I found at least 6 for West Coast data sets. There are probably more with upcoming publications. And as a first pass to standardize the data, we used for Oregon to British Columbia marshes and tidal swamps, we used Aaron Peck's data set, which has a nicely developed relationship. We used a British Columbia study, Postlewaite et al., for Oregon to British Columbia seagrass. And then for the San Francisco Bay Area marshes, that's sort of a different climate regime in Central California. We decided to use the Callaway data set. And this is the Callaway relationship between carbon content and organic matter content. So carbon density is just computed as the product of the bulk density and the percent organic carbon. To compute stocks, then you just sum that over a specified depth interval. So this is just one example of a core and how it would look in the database. We have the down core values of the length of the subsample, the bulk density, organic matter, converted into percent C if needed, carbon density, and then a carbon stock. And so we computed a few metrics because all the cores vary in length. We computed a few metrics, so we calculated stocks in the top half meter. If the core was shorter than half meter, we had to extrapolate down. And similarly, we computed stocks in the top meter. Again, had to extrapolate in some cases. And then I'll show this a little bit later, but to compute carbon accumulation rates, we needed a carbon density. We needed sort of a standard way to compute that. And as a first pass, and I would love to talk with people about ways to improve this, but as a first pass, we just averaged the carbon density in the 20 to 30 centimeter section of the core, the thought being that that was an area below the active root zone and perhaps below active decomposition, where you had a better picture of the percent refractory carbon, and as opposed to looking at the surface where you may have a lot of labile carbon that hasn't been yet decomposed. But I'd love to talk with people more about that, because I'm sure there's different ways to think about how to compute that. Okay, so in the database for each core, we compiled any additional data that we could find and really kind of focused on these parameters. So we wanted core latitude, longitude. We actually have that for most of the cores. In some cases, we have only a site level latitude, longitude. Core elevation in NAVD 88, the habitat type, the disturbance status, the dominant vegetation, so whether it's a swamp or a marsh or a neograss meadow, what are the dominant species in the vicinity of the core? And then where possible, sediment grain size. So for these above, most of the cores we actually were able to obtain data for. The sediment grain size is much more spotty. A lot of authors don't have the data. We haven't incorporated yet, and I'd really like to, is salinity regime, because I think that salinity is really important for a number of reasons that have come up in the workshop. So if any of you have interest and motivation to help out with that, I'd love to think about ways to incorporate salinity. Maybe the most basic thing we'll do is just sort of classify into these broad classes. The salinity data are heterogeneous in the way they're collected, the location they're collected, when they're collected, and so it would be a lot of work to incorporate that, but maybe we can do a basic classification of salinity regime. All right, these are a summary of the carbon stocks values by wetland type. So on the left is the carbon stocks in the top half meter, and then on the right is stocks in the top meter of sediment, classified by wetland type, and with sample sizes in blue up top. So again, tidal marshes are the most prevalent in the data set. And we found that these woody wetlands, this is consistent with what Boone found for the 200 or so cores specific to the stocks project, but these woody wetlands, the scrub shrub and the tidal swamps, do have higher stocks levels than the tidal marshes. Interestingly, the tide flats, so these are unvegetated tide flats, not a really large data set, but kind of showing that they have stocks that are as high or a little bit higher than the seagrass meadows in the data set as well. And the pastures are fascinating to me, that the pastures really actually have pretty high carbon stocks. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that slide. These are the carbon stocks summarized by geographic region, so just by state in this case, stocks to 1 meter depth. On the left is seagrass meadows and the emergent marshes on the right. So the sample sizes aren't too great for seagrass meadows, but there does seem to be a trend that for some reason Washington seagrass meadows seem to have lower carbon stocks than BC to the north or the states to the south. In the emergent marshes, however, relatively similar carbon stocks across the states and provinces in this preliminary analysis. And then if we drill down a little bit more into the carbon stocks within the tidal marshes and look a little bit more closely at those data, again, Boone already touched on this, but there's a lot of variability within the habitat class. So within the tidal marshes, we have values that are maybe as low as 30 or 40 megagrams per hectare, and then we have some that reach over 700 megagrams per hectare. So a lot of variability in the data set. And then didn't get too far into this, but I looked into the literature at a couple of other regions globally just to see how the Pacific Northwest compared with some of these other regions. So here in the Northeast Pacific, we have a range of 31 to 739 megagrams per hectare. That's kind of comparable to the range in Australian tidal marshes, although our mean is higher than Australian tidal marshes, and also comparable to the range in marshes from China, although the data set's super tiny. So one cool thing that came out of this is just how much data we do have for the Pacific Northwest. A lot of it hasn't been published, and so it's not out there, it's not accessible, it's sort of in individual labs and individual hard drives at this point. But we do have a lot of data, you know, as much as the entire continent of Australia in this particular study. Okay, so the other thing, the stocks project really focused on stocks, but a lot of people care about accretion rates and carbon sequestration rates, particularly in the context of restoration. So we did want to try to compile these data wherever available. Now the data are more sparse, so we have almost 600 stocks cores, but probably only about 150 sequestration cores, so not as much data here. The first thing we can look at is the sediment accretion rate. So how much sediment is accumulating in these wetland types per year on average. The sequestration and accretion rate data are more heterogeneous because they've used a variety of methods. So lead-210 is the most common, but we also have cores that are cesium-137 dated. We have a few C14 cores. We have a little bit of set data. Katrina provided a little bit of set data from Washington. And I guess the fifth method is to sample like a restored wetland and look at a density change in the sediments, and you can kind of estimate an accretion rate that way. So we don't have any data yet of that type in the database, but it's sort of heterogeneous. So as a first pass, I just looked at the lead-210 to not confound methodology here. So these are the accretion rates in each of the 6 wetland types that we looked at. Marshes by far are really well sampled, and the sample sizes unfortunately are quite low for these other ecosystems. I just plotted 2 recent sea level rise rates on here. So Charleston here, the last couple decades have had a 1.1 millimeter per year sea level rise rate, and a little bit higher in Seattle. But you can see most of the data fall above those lines. So accretion rates, recent accretion rates are keeping pace with recent sea level rise rates. Whether that's going to be true in the future or not is a different question, but so far. The median tidal marsh accretion rate for our largest sample size is about 2.2 millimeters per year with lead-210. And then I just, the same figure, but I just wanted to show it, throw in some of the NOAA sea level rise rates for the West Coast from San Diego to Juneau. And they are kind of all over the map, so you do really need to, from a sea level rise perspective as well as a carbon stocks and sequestration perspective, you really do need local data for your project or for your analysis. Some of this regional variability is driven by geologic tectonics and glacial rebound, for instance. So Central Oregon is sinking. The very southern and very northern part of Oregon are not. Alaska is rising, so they have negative sea level rise rates in Alaska. So this drilling down to the estuary level, if possible, is really important, and hopefully the database will help people pull the data that they need for their estuary of interest. So if you take the lead-210 accretion rates and you multiply it by carbon density, you can get an estimate of carbon accumulation rates. So this is what we did as a first pass for the lead-210 data. And these are the sequestration rates by wetland type. So in general, they kind of mirror the carbon stocks data. So the highest carbon accumulation rates are in the woody wetlands, the scrub shrub and the tidal swamps. But the data are so sparse there. So even if we had 2 or 3 or 4 more cores, we would double the sample sizes here. This was an interesting pattern as well, again, that the tidal flats may be, who knows with a sample size of 3, but may actually have carbon accumulation rates that are comparable or exceed nearby seagrass meadows. Okay, and then this is just for the marshes only, again, because it's the largest data set. These are the carbon accumulation rates by state, and they're fairly similar in California, Oregon, and Washington. And to compare that to some global values here, so we have a little bit higher carbon accumulation rate than Australian tidal marshes, but perhaps a lower rate than those in China. So, okay, so from the database, we wanted to produce a couple of different products that would help the different end user communities. So the first is this detailed database, which I've kind of been showing you and walking you through. These are flat files. And we are working with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center to help them. They've got a nice web interface, they've got a searchable map, so we're working with them to help them obtain data sets that they haven't been able to incorporate yet. We also are thinking about providing a basic end user summary. I haven't gotten a lot of feedback on that, so if you have any feedback, let me know if something like that would be useful. We've thought of maybe a very simple website, for example, that just doesn't give you all the detailed down core data, but it may just give you summary values by habitat type, by region, by specific estuaries or something. Again, I haven't gotten a lot of feedback, so if you have any ideas of how that could be useful to you, please let me know. And then this wasn't really planned when we wrote the proposal, but it's been a lot of work to compile the data. And I've thought that a data synthesis of some type of publication would also be a very useful product because we've done so much work to compile the information so far. So some of the potential research questions we could ask in the data synthesis would be what's the variability in stocks by habitat type? So Boone's already kind of getting at that with the smaller data set, but we can add in scrub shrub and tidal flats and other things. We can take a closer look at potential climate relationships with either stocks or sequestration rates across this broader geographic region. This publication will allow us to sort of identify data gaps and sort of talk about those to the academic community. What do we have and what kinds of additional data do we need? So if anybody's, I'm working on an outline for this potential paper. There's a lot in the database. It could be 2 or 3 syntheses. So if you want to collaborate, if you feel like you really want to lead a paper and use the data to ask a specific question, just let me know and let's talk about it. I've been talking with a postdoc at UC Davis who had a great idea. She said that we have very little data on scaling up the entire regions of coastline, and you could take this data, scale up for the entire Pacific Northwest, estimate the total area of marshes and seagrass and so forth, and we can get a total carbon stocks for the whole area. And I'm like, okay, great. You can run with that paper. So if you have any ideas, please talk to me. So we're working with CERC to provide data for their repository. You can go right now online. That's their homepage, and then you can go to their atlas here, and you can zoom into specific places and see what data are available. We've shared the locations of our 34 sampling sites. Once I think Boone wants to get this primary paper out. Once he does, then we'll be able to provide all the carbon data from our stocks project to them as well. And then this is, what a end user-friendly sort of summary might look like on a web page, for instance, if there is enough end user interest to produce something like that. We could provide basic information about the core and some calculated values from the core, and we could provide pictures and coordinates and make something that's more user-friendly. And then this is, again, I kind of already talked about this, but some of the potential things we could do with the data synthesis. So again, if anyone's interested in collaborating on this, please let me know. So compiling the database has led to a number of challenges that some of which I expected, some of which I probably didn't expect. So one is that we have a lot of variation in methods and sampling, so you have to think very carefully about how to standardize different methodologies and come up with results that are consistent with each other. So one basic instance is that LOI and CHN are sometimes measured, so you have these different methodologies. Within studies that do loss on ignition, there's actually quite a range of oven temperatures and times that are used. And this paper by Hyrie et al. Shows that it actually makes a difference in terms of your calculated organic matter level. There's a lot of variability in the core depth. We tried to only use cores that were at least 18 to 20 centimeters deep. There are shallower cores, but for computing a 1/2 or 1 meter stocks, it seems a little iffy to use really, really short cores. And then the accretion rate methods vary a lot, and so often the accretion rates you get with cesium-137 are higher than those with lead-210, not always, but often higher. And cesium is, there's a new paper by Judy Drexler suggesting that probably we're near the end of the lifespan of when we can use cesium-137 in North America to actually date cores. So she recommends just using lead-210 going forward. A lot of the data we've compiled that are unpublished, so it's been really great that people have been willing to share unpublished data with us, but we have to be cognizant of and respectful of data embargoes and not releasing data that people don't want to have released yet. There's varying levels of replication, so Boone's layout is very consistent of 6 cores per site, but studies vary tremendously, and sometimes there's just a single core per site. And then there are varying levels of precision in data availability, and then quite a few cores actually have data gaps, so we have to do some interpolation, sometimes a little bit of extrapolation to get the data all consistent with each other. So, so far it's been great to also compile the database and get a better picture of the data gaps that we have for the Pacific Northwest. So the database is very heavily skewed towards tidal marshes. We'd love to have more data on seagrasses, woody wetlands, and even tide flats. Probably the bulk of our tidal swamp data actually comes from our stocks project itself. So we'd love to have more data on the Sitka spruce swamps from British Columbia to Southern Oregon. And there are a couple of other types of swamps that would be great. So there are places in Oregon and even Northern California that have salix and cornus swamps. So these are areas that are very sparsely sampled. Sequestration rate data are quite a bit rarer than stocks data. So there's a premium on that. If you have sequestration rate data, we'd love to incorporate that. And we need much more data on restored wetlands, what's happening in the sites that have already been restored to date. And then a few other data gaps. A lot of the smaller estuaries on the outer coast are relatively undersampled. So if you recall my earlier maps, we kind of have these big gaps between Humboldt and Southern Oregon, but there's lots of tiny little estuaries throughout the Pacific Northwest that we have no data for. British Columbia is relatively undersampled. And we don't have anything from Alaska, but we may have a data set or two on its way. And there are actually a few of our larger estuaries where we have very little data for, so not much from Willapa Bay, and I think nothing from the Fraser River, and these are major estuaries. All right, so the database exists currently as flat files, and we're going to be sharing that with the CERC team. And then we also have the option of storing our data on the NERS CDMO, the Centralized Data Management Office. Thank you, Management Office. So they host all of the hydrologic data and meteorological data that are collected by the NERS, and it sounds like there's an opportunity to host some of our data as well. We'd love to secure some additional funding in the future so that we can keep maintaining the database. Data sets roll in when people are ready to share. I think we'll have a lot more potential data sets we could incorporate in the near future. We'll need some funding to keep that going, and then also to expand the database. So we could include set data, plant biomass data, and greenhouse gas emissions, but I think at least some dedicated funding for that is going to be needed. All right, I'll just go through this quickly. Some of the take-home points from what we've been able to compile so far are that our wetlands in the Northwest have really substantial carbon stocks, particularly in our marshes and particularly in our woody wetlands. We probably have geographic differences in sequestration rate and stocks data, but we do need more data for particular wetland types to assess whether that's true and consistent across the region. We have a number of data gaps, so we'd like more sequestration rate data, woody wetlands, restored and disturbed sites, and then filling in some of these geographic gaps. So I want to thank everyone who's contributed data. This is just kind of a short list of people, usually the first author of a study. Usually there's many co-authors, but lots of people have been willing to share data with us, and that's made the database possible. And then we've been funded mainly by the Neuroscience Collaborative for this. All right, are there any questions about the database? Scott?
More comment is the difference between the lead-210 and the cesium-137 is they're going down different time frames, and the deeper carbon this is well shown in freshwater. This is well shown in freshwater peatlands. The deeper you go, and the longer you go, the lower the sequestration rate, because the deeper carbon decays at a slow rate, but it does decay.
Not
and
zero.
so you get substantially lower sequestration rates with more profile you can see.
That makes sense, and a few of our cores are C14 methods that go back. They'll tend to be the 3 to 5 meter cores that go back a few thousand years, and I can't remember I don't think we put in any C14 rates yet, but it would be very cool to compare those with the lead-210 and then the cesium, which is the shortest. Well, I guess the set data would be the shortest time frame.
So yeah, that's kind of what you would expect from first principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
No, it doesn't have a light on it. This one doesn't have a light on it either.
This light right here.
What's the green one?
Yeah, it's green. You got it.
Okay. Yeah, as an end user, it'd be great. Lisa and I would love to spend a little bit of time and think through with you what kind of information we'd like to extract from the data set that the group have collected as we're thinking about the national inventory. In particular, I think one of the aspects we'll be really interested in is the forested and scrub shrub, which is a data gap in our inventory right now.
Yeah.
But I think it would help us think through the process of how do we extract this. So yes, we'd love to have that conversation.
Great.
So we'll follow that later.
Awesome.
And you mentioned back in the presentation about different variables, and salinity was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about this one a little bit, because some of the data that we're getting out of, well, Lisa Marie and colleagues are getting out of Sassoon is that the open water body is fresh-ish, but the soils are saline, and so the methane emissions are lower than you would predict from the water column. And so I think what's happening is if we put in an evapotranspiration to precipitation ratio, we'd find that site has high ET to precipitation. And as you go further north, so that drives salinity within the interior of the marsh. As you go further north, precipitation might exceed ET. And so that drives water and fresh water into the center of the marsh. And so it might be a way of teasing this out a little bit, methane emissions against ET and precipitation. So we're just putting that out there. So.
Yeah, that's a great thought. We have a few data sets where we can test this a little bit more carefully. Unfortunately, all of them are still sort of in progress, but a San Francisco Bay data set, a Tillamook Bay data set, and then our own stocks data where we have salinities from both the channel and groundwater, and they're usually in paired wells at each site. So we can kind of look, and we may have enough sites where we could see whether that salinity difference between the channel and the marsh itself is actually correlated with evapotranspiration. I think that would actually be a really cool thing to take a look at.
Just as a little side story, there's some seasonal ponds, so not interior marsh soils, but we created some bird habitats as part of a restoration project some years ago. And we had to predict salinity for ponds which dried down through time, but also had influxes of water either through the ground or through overtopping. And then when we built the ponds, we were remarkably successful at calculating through a year on a date. Well, we did on a monthly time step the salinity within a pond. So I think with some ET and precipitation data and some calibration, we could probably calculate the salinity within a soil. But we can have a go at it.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Maybe one of the challenges there is making sure that we can find a climate station close enough to our, because some of our sites are kind of out there and data can be kind of sparse in some regions, but I think that's a great idea. Yeah. All right.
Any more questions? Okay. All right, so thanks for hanging in there, everybody. We're at the part of the day where we're winding down, but in my opinion, this is a pretty important conversation to have. This is an interactive conversation about next steps. Pretty much all day we've heard results, and all of those results are always tempered by data needs, data gaps, etc. And so this is no different. And there's some pretty important ones that I just wanted to run through. I've kind of summarized them in big, blocky pieces. And our goal here is to figure out what the next proposal should look like, proposals in order to fill some of these. So let me just run through these real quick here. You've been hearing about these all day. So we know that we need a lot of information is missing on greenhouse gas emissions, and we've known that from the start. Again, we got started with the carbon stocks project, knowing that we needed to fill data gaps in emissions and carbon sequestration rates, and importantly, continuing that in least disturbed sites, but also adding more disturbed sites and restored tidal wetland sites. Okay, everyone is hopefully in agreement about that. And we need to focus in particular on the methane variability driven by these ecosystem type drivers. There's that reed canary grass question that came up in Lisa's presentation about just figuring out how to quantify that a little bit more in wet pastures in these wetlands. There's also the allochthonous carbon question, a bigger picture way to describe that Steve Crooks brings up is lateral movement of carbon. And again, in these different least disturbed, restored wetland sites under a range of site conditions. And then of course, the effects of sea level rise on all of it. Now, in terms of the next steps for the part of the questions, especially the emissions part, there's already a project that is getting underway that is from the Eastler it's called the Eastler Project in short. And I'm going to let Chris, who's the lead on that project, just say a couple words about that, if you wouldn't mind, with a microphone.
Yeah, this is a 3-year project just starting this fall, and we have a couple goals. We're going to try to look at a couple of different services of tidal wetlands. So one would be the protection of coastlines. So we're going to Dave Sutherland at University of Oregon is going to be leading hydrologic modeling of the Coos Bay estuary and the Columbia River estuary. And then we're going to also be doing greenhouse gas emissions measurements in those 2 estuaries. So this actually would be an opportunity for us to partly fill some of the data gaps that have been identified in these 2 projects. So yeah, it's just getting off the ground. We haven't done it. We're having our first team meeting tomorrow, so check back in a year or 2.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. And that's why I brought that up, is because this is a project that, as Chris says, will be filling some of those greenhouse gas emissions data gaps for the Coos and some of the lower Columbia. So stand by for that. But it's nice to know that is happening. So going back to the Near Science Collaborative, which is a very good place to go for the support of these data gaps, filling these data gaps, because we advertised to them in our initial proposals that this is part of a working group effort that is multi-staged. And so the idea here is that we would go back to them and say, hey, phase 1 is done. These are the results, and these are the data that we still need to collect, and the data gaps that we need to address to keep understanding how carbon financing and blue carbon functions here. So we have been working through a collaborative research part of their program. There are 2 other parts, and I might talk a little bit about those, but mainly focusing on the collaborative research. Again, it's a program that's about generating new data to inform decision makers and users. And it's a 3-year max program, $600,000 max, which is a little bit smaller than it was before. And the RFP is actually open right now, and it's due in pre-proposals are due in December. I think it's December 11th, something like that. So I'd like to sort of take that and suggest that we go back to the Near Science Collaborative, and this is assuming that the reserves that we've been working with, South Slough and Padilla Bay, still have this work on their priorities and are willing to keep working with us on that. So there's a conversation to be had about that. But assuming that we would move forward on this, again, it's a good program. They're already invested in this. Competitive-wise, it's a smaller. It's less competitive because everybody has to be working within the NEARS, and it's not like an NSF, which is can be huge. So I'm going to run a concept by you all, and just tell you how I think, in the barest of bones, we could proceed here with a research proposal with the Near Science Collaborative. And the first element would be at about the same field sites, again, filling in some sites that we haven't been able to get to before, and maybe taking out some sites that we don't need. Including those restoration sites, conduct greenhouse gas emissions research and collect carbon sequestration rate data. So that just fills that first obvious data gap. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation to be had there about which sites and how this is going to work, but just throwing that first element out there. And actually use those new data to go back, and I've talked to some of you guys about this, and it's, there's a lot to talk about again here. But go ahead and use those data once we have them in hand to recalculate the financial feasibility and the other calculations that we did in the feasibility assessment, or what were you calling it now, Scott? The scoping assessment, and just close that gap and just come back to people and say, okay, now we do have more of a feasibility assessment with data that are a little bit, or not a little bit, that we have more confidence in, and also to do that not in a hypothetical scenario or scenarios, but actually find some sites that we can focus in on and actually apply those calculations and the financial feasibility to. I think end users would get a lot out of that. So that right there might be enough of a research project right there. But then we still have this lateral carbon flux situation, but that is probably a standalone project. Am I seeing heads nodding? Yes. Scott says yes. So I think there's a lot to talk about there, and hard to say. It probably doesn't fit into the same project. And then we really do need to keep this database alive. We need to keep this, keep building this database in all the ways that Chris was suggesting. And this is where a science transfer grant might come in. And this is the RFP for this, if I recall the slide previous, comes out in the spring or something like that. So I see this as also a separate thing, unless we can squeeze it into this project up here. And I think that's the concept, very, very simple. So the idea here now is to open this up to you guys and hear what you have to say. Does this seem like a reasonable approach to you guys, or what? Steve?
Yeah, great. Starting at the bottom. I don't know if you've reached out yet, or Chris has reached out to CERC about, I like the one at the bottom there. And what might make that one, I know they're looking for funding to maintain their database as well. And that could actually be something that includes every nerd. So it'd be interesting to put in a proposal that recognizes, because what they're looking for is, they provide a service where they help the nerds put data into their database and one thing like that. So I don't know how many proposals they get that include everybody, but that might be a person that include everybody. Just throwing that out there. So, but then in the other questions at the top, there's a lot we need in terms of the methane numbers, and I would, it might be worth putting everything into getting the stuff at the top there, the carbon sequestration rates together. And as you said, the allotedness issue is a big one that always gets punted, but it is a big one. It's probably better to separate that off to a different proposal and do the sequestration and the methane emissions more completely. Is
it fair to say that the methane data gap is a higher higher priority to fill than the carbon flux, lateral flux?
Yeah.
Okay,
But it's in a second.
a close second,
Yeah,
okay.
But another grant opportunities, maybe DOE or something like that, might be, they might buy the lot from us one, or the
Okay.
electric transfer.
Scott, can you grab a microphone?
The limitation of the greenhouse gases is that there's kind of a trade-off between numbers of sites and intensity of measurements, because you need to get the seasonal signal. So it's just an inherent trade-off when you, versus the sequestration, you take one sample and you sort of get your number, it doesn't work that way.
Right, right.
So,
So complexities to work out, logistics to work out. And, yeah, and how that affects the budget.
exactly.
So before you give that away, so seat of the pants, does that seem like a doable one project?
Sure, it does. I mean, it depends on numbers of sites but
And how many people involved and what equipment we have available?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's just the details.
All right, so we need
Money
to
that goes with it.
dig in on the details on that. Okay.
Just to add to that, I would second the priority of methane, particularly in disturbed sites, as we've talked about. And I would say having a very in-depth, robust methane study would be incredibly valuable. And there's always trade-offs with cost and all of these other things that are also really valuable. But as a potential end user of this information, I would just say some really robust work on methane would be fantastic.
Okay.
It's always, it would be, in terms of logistics, you could do much more with many more sites if they were in one area. Because the traveling, since you're doing this repeatedly, is a huge part of the time sink of just getting around.
Right. Jenny, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of Steve Perks just was talking about on the last one, the database, and scaling it up to the reserve system level. I know a lot of reserves are interested in blue carbon, and it might be a lot of work. Sounds like it's a lot of work. But another potential funding source could be the reserve system also has the national product funds. This year their focus is on communication and outreach products. And the RP just came out and it's due February 7th. So I can send that.
Okay, I like that. I thought you were going to tell me it was due in November, December.
So that would be a good project for
Yeah. Great, thank you. Back to Steve.
Yeah, and back on the methane and Scott's point about the carbon, we might consider doing a smaller area and getting more detailed information like Steve mentioned, and seeing if we could turn it into predictive modeling. If we know something about water table and temperature and ET, etc., can we actually make this predictive? And that might be better in the smaller systems.
But don't you need to have the data from the other sites to check your predictability,
Yeah.
to verify?
Yeah, if we could have a verification site somewhere else.
To some extent, the climate just doesn't vary that much. I think, Chris, you may have shown some of the climate data. But if you're just in the Pacific Northwest and you're not going down further, particularly if you're along the coast, it isn't that variable. Site conditions are more variable.
Actually, I have a quick question along those lines. Steve or Scott, do modeled data work for the methodology? Double thumbs up. Okay, answers that question.
So long as it's peer reviewed and the model is parameterized for that geographical area and those conditions. cited, how people cite these plots, but if the idea is to connect this to restoration and restoration funding, I mean, one way to think about this could be looking at, start with the disturbed sites, like where we have disturbed sites, and then, try to focus some of the methane data collection around these areas, and then, maybe find reference sites that would represent the same conditions, the restored conditions. But, I think in the past, everybody wants to go sample the pristine sort of natural sites. I think we know those sites pretty well. We got more data around those. So I would say like disturbed sites and sites that have like lower salinity. Because we know higher salinity sites don't produce a lot of methane, so there's probably not a data gap there.
I would like to test for the Pacific Northwest that 18 parts per thousand threshold. Okay, so Katrina's next. And while she's talking, Steve, if you could give Fran a microphone. Or Scott.
Just going back to the logistics of it and the travel aspect of it, I don't know if you were thinking about using some money to buy another greenhouse gas analyzer so that we could cover more ground.
That would be on the table. I don't know how long it would be on the table. So we would have to look at that in the same way that Scott is really suggesting that we, dig in on that. And then I guess, look at the trade-offs between doing that and introducing more of a modeling approach. So, Fran.
So getting back to the communications, I didn't actually hear one point there, but there's a lot of interest in this blue carbon, and it's really important. I saw on the proposal that this is to communicate to a larger management. So I don't know how to think about this. If there's reed canary grass benefits and detriments, converting it to marsh, and the length of time, and how does that relate to other values, fish and wildlife values, and accretion values, and that. So maybe as a minor issue coming out of this, though, some ways, talking points, what you know, what you don't know in a real clear way would be really helpful, because people want to apply it now, and I don't know if it's ready to apply it now while there's other values that we really know about.
Okay.
Sorry, I had my hand up too, but maybe.
Okay. Go for it.
Okay. So this is Sarah Kane with the Estuary Partnership, and we monitor a lot of sites in the Columbia River Estuary, all the way from the mouth of the Columbia up to, like Franz Lake, which is really close to the Bonneville Dam. That's a pretty interesting gradient in terms of tidal, saltier to fresh. And I know Crest works in these areas as well. And so I think that, we do a lot of really intensive monitoring. We'd be really happy to partner with someone doing a greenhouse gas study, kind of partnership in terms of like sharing data and resources, because I know that it can take a lot of effort to move around and study all these sites. And if we have this gradient that we're already studying, it makes sense that we would work together. So I just want to throw that out there.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that.
Just kind of in response to Katrina and thinking about the systems, and also in regard to modeling, what Steve's point is, I think one of the avenues we've gone down is trying to take continuous high-frequency measurements, because the environmental conditions in these areas are so dynamic that if we want to model, we have to be able to actually correlate what's happening in kind of more of a real time, in my opinion. And so we have what we'd like to sort of contribute to this process is we have a Picarro G2508, which it's nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide, and then sort of a system to collect data on the marshes or swamp surfaces. At this point in time, we can do 6 measurements an hour, so 6 locations an hour, but our multiplexer is set up to do up to 12. So we'd like to be a part of that. If it works out, if it makes sense to lean toward the modeling. Yeah.
I have another car.
Yeah.
I know.
Okay, Ed, were you?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Scott mentioned about restoration piece there at the top. If there was a way to select sites, restoration sites where there was perhaps a good data set, which is harder as you go back in time, but to perhaps, I don't know what your thinking is, but perhaps tease out benefits, restoration over time, and perhaps look at what the maturation of restoration looks like to achieve goals, thresholds for the emissions and sequestration. Is that your thought process?
Well, it would be to really dig in and go to the next level on specific sites, specific restoration sites, on understanding the feasibility of carbon financing with new data from that site and from other local sites, all within the context of all the other benefits that the restoration project would be looking to fulfill, just like any project. And as you know, each project might have its own slight, different special angle to it. So all of those things would be taken into consideration, especially, as I understand it, if you're talking about a voluntary market and all those co-benefits really start to add up and help out with the carbon price for offsets.
Because of the short time of these grants, it's much more profitable. We usually do a space for time substitution. So you try to find relatively recently restored sites and sites that are older and extrapolate from that, because you typically only have a couple of years to collect your data.
Sure, okay.
Other questions? So I'm hearing a pretty solid support for next step emissions / carbon sequestration rate, but as mentioned, there's quite a bit of detail to work out with respect to the time that we would have and the money, the budget that we would have, and had a couple of ideas about the database, which would be separate, and then the close second would be the carbon flux piece. So we'll have to think about potential funders for that as a standalone. Steve, did you have more
just
of a
to
comment?
mention, I think for methane studies, it's good to have a couple of years worth of data, just to catch some sense of the annual variability. Of course, we're probably hitting an El Nino in one of those years, but and it gives you the third year to work up the data.
Right. Okay, so minimum 2 seasons.
Yeah.
2.
3 opportunities.
Yeah. Are we happy? Okay. I think that's it. Thank you very much for being here and sticking through the whole day. And I think we are adjourned.
Did we thank South Slough too for hosting? If we didn't,
Sure, we did that at the beginning, and we should do that again at the end. Thank you, Steve. Thanks to South Slough for hosting, and thanks for John for all the logistics, and Ed for keeping me sane up here on this computer. So, and thanks to the video guys, Vinny and Dave. Thanks very much. So, I will.
Thank you, Craig.
You're welcome. I will get the videos, clips from these guys, and upload them to YouTube. And maybe someday you can be like Boone and get shown on the, at a meeting. Okay, thank you.